Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, Eamonn O'Flaherty gives insight into the results of his Teagasc UCD Master Study, looking to understand the opportunities and barriers to dry stock farmers taking up part-time employment on dairy farms. Eamonn started by explaining the reason he carried out this research.
This research kind of came from two areas, I suppose. Firstly, from dairy farmers' point of view, we were looking at part-time roles on dairy farms due to the expansion in the national dairy herd post quotas. Okay, so I suppose it has been well documented that since the expansion of the dairy herd, that there has been I suppose a certain degree of labour shortage in the sector. But I suppose on the flip side, and you could look at this in another way as well, that there has been a lot of both part-time and full-time employment opportunities created due to this expansion post-quota. So that was, I suppose, the first rationale for this research.
Looking then, you specifically looked at dry stock farmers as a potential solution to that labour shortage. Why did you go down the route of dry stock farmers?
Yeah, so Emma-Louise, I suppose we looked at dry stock farmers, I suppose, first of all, with a lot of dry stock farmers are employed off-farm already in similar roles to dairy farm employment, okay? So we were looking at them because I suppose they are a demographic who could potentially avail of some of these opportunities on dairy farms, okay? I suppose, firstly, due to the close proximity of dairy farms and dry stock farms across the country, and secondly, I suppose, the skill set and the crossover skills between both dry stock and dairy farmers. So I suppose there was potential then from this research to benefit both sides. So it wasn't necessarily trying to fix a dairy farmer's labour issue, but it's just combine both and potentially benefit both farmers, both types of farmers, really.
And from working with these dry stock farmers and having conversation with them, Eamonn, can you give us some insight into the potential barriers they see, going and engaging with a dairy farmer and working with them?
A few of the main barriers that would have came up through the interviews that I carried out with dry stock farmers. Okay, so firstly, I suppose salary would be a main issue, and the relative salary compared to if they're working in a different sector. I suppose secondly then there's I suppose the perception that dairy farm work is associated with tough manual labour and not great working conditions. Okay, so that would have been a reoccurring theme that came up through the interviews as well. Thirdly then, I suppose the seasonality associated with dairy farm employment. Okay, so that was a major issue, I suppose, from a dry stock farmer or a potential employee's perspective. Fourthly then, I suppose the facilities on dairy farms, okay, were identified as a barrier towards potential employment. Okay, and then finally, I suppose the last barrier was more or less dairy farmers' attitudes towards the employee, or the perception that dry stock farmers had of dairy farmers' attitudes towards employment or being an employer, more or less. Okay, so there were the main barriers identified through the research. And
I guess it's very logical, Eamonn, in terms of, anyone that works on a dairy farm, before they go in, these are all discussion points and potential barriers, or, where things are positive, it's a real attraction to a farm. I suppose firstly, delving into salary, I suppose what are the expectations? Minimum wage is now at €10 per hour and it's up to €10.20. How does dairy farming for part-time workers compare with, other industries and other sectors that these part-time farmers are engaging in?
Yeah, I suppose salary was the first one that came up. So I suppose from a dry stock farmer's perspective, they felt that dairy farm employment wasn't going to be as competitive with similarly skilled work in different sectors. So just for example, factory work and construction sectors. Okay, so they felt they get better paid within these sectors. I suppose they also felt in that a lot of work on dairy farms is offered at minimum wage. Okay, they didn't necessarily want to be working for minimum wage. I suppose then as well on salaries, they felt that, especially where dry stock farmers were going to take up relief milking opportunities, okay, that they felt that there was a level of skill and responsibility towards milking, okay, and they wanted to get paid or compensated accordingly then for this, okay, and they felt that this might necessarily be the case. And then I suppose finally they felt, or there was a perception that I suppose the tasks around milking are often just expected to be done or built into the milking rate, such as like feeding calves or cleaning cubicles there this time of year, okay, at the shoulder of the year. So this is often just maybe built into the milking rate. And these are kind of, I suppose, what the dry stock farmers that I spoke to highlighted when they were talking about salary, okay. So if there was these tests that were going to be done after milking, that they were, I suppose, on an hourly rate then, and then your milking rate was separate, okay. So this is just some of the parts they highlighted with salary.
And I guess that final point that you've made, comes into, point number 5 in terms of attitude and perception. So, they might be there to do some relief milking, but then there are other tasks, maybe scraping and libing cubicles or feeding calves, that come into the task, but I suppose they weren't set out at the start. So maybe a clear description in terms of what is expected, I guess the expectations of the dairy farmer, that they're set out from the start, that if you're relief milking, the task is to drove in the cows, milk them and put them back out to the paddock again. But if there are additional tasks that are required on the farm, depending on the time of year, that is clear to the part-time worker when they come in. I guess looking then at your second point, Eamonn, and the perception, this tough manual job that dairy farming is, and then the conditions of work. I guess, that is a big perception. There's a lot of mechanisation, I guess, in dairy farming now, and, I suppose the tough, heavy lifting is not necessarily always there. But from the dry stock farmers' perspective, can you give us some insight into what they were thinking there?
Okay, yeah. So as I said, the second major recurring barrier, I suppose, through the interviews was the tough manual labour and the working conditions associated with the job. Okay, so they felt it was a physically demanding and tough job, with long working hours. Okay, so and I suppose, and like what they were doing, they were kind of comparing to the other opportunities, so what they were employed in. So they basically felt that there's easier ways of making a living, okay, so with less demanding and less physical work, okay. And then I suppose on these opportunities, they were kind of explaining to me that there's oftentimes more of an even spread of the workload over a team of employees, say for example on a construction site, whereas a lot of the time on a dairy farm, okay, just given the scale of most dairy farms, employment scenarios are often one-on-one, okay. So there's, I suppose that was their perception in that where you were one-on-one with the farmer, it was going to be a demanding job.
And I guess a simple communication starting out would, I suppose, lead the part-time labour on the farm to understand where they're coming from, what the team consists of, from that perspective. Looking then into seasonality, Eamonn, obviously within dairy farms we're used to block calving within Ireland, predominantly spring calving. So that obviously feeds into some barriers. Can you give us more insight there?
Seasonality, Emma-Louise, was a massive barrier from a dry stock farmer or a potential employee's perspective. I suppose, as you were alluded to there, a lot of the labour on dairy farms and the perception of labour on dairy farms is that dairy farms only need labour for that 8 to 10 week period over the spring where they're busy calving, and then there's a perception then from a dry stock farmer's point of view that dairy farmers won't want you after this, whereas from their perspective they are looking for employment opportunities that are on a part-time basis but cover the full calendar year, okay. So this is the seasonality is a major barrier from a dry stock farmer's perspective to taking up employment on a dairy farm.
Is there a solution to this, Eamonn?
Okay, I suppose, Emma-Louise, from a dairy farmer's perspective, it might be important to maybe move away from the perception that you only require labour for that 8 to 10 week period. Okay, so I suppose, and move away from the idea that you're going to get them in the spring, because that's not necessarily going to be the case if you leave it till the spring. Okay, so it might be important maybe start, if you want labour now, if you want labour in the spring, to maybe start looking now. Okay, so I suppose there's a lot of tasks that can be done, I suppose, this time of year as well, especially from with a part-time employee. So I suppose getting housing ready for calving. We're going to be feeding silage, I suppose, this time of year, and bedding cubicles and stuff. So there is a lot of work that can be done for a part-time employee this time of year, and where you can offer work throughout the calendar year for a part-time employee, you are going to be more likely to retain them. Okay, so whereas if you're just employing someone for that 8 to 10 week period every spring, it's not necessarily going to be the case that you're going to get the same person coming back every year. Okay, so I suppose this is just something that dairy farmers should be kind of starting to look at.
And I think, Eamonn, it's a very timely time of the year for us to have this discussion. And as you say, it's no harm to get this part-time labour now and have them in and familiar with the yard, that, they're not just coming in on the 1st of February when things are getting extremely busy and there's little time to train them. There's essentially 2 months of milking left in the majority of parlours in Ireland this year, and where we can get people in and get them used to the system and familiar to the milking parlour, it means a lot, and it reduces an awful lot of stress in the springtime. Looking then to facilities, Eamonn, this is something that has been highlighted. Martina Gormley, the labour specialist within Teagasc, and also some farmers we've spoken to would say that their facilities for themselves alone, but also then to attract staff, is important. Did you see this with the dry stock farmers?
Definitely. So this was, I suppose, Emma-Louise, another key barrier towards the uptake of employment on dairy farms. Okay, so dry stock farmers I spoke to would have highlighted the lack of facilities. So they would have kind of explained to me and felt that where dry stock or dairy farmers have expanded quickly over the last few years, oftentimes, I suppose, the facilities haven't followed suit. So from their point of view, then this makes dairy farms less attractive places to work. And I suppose one thing that dry stock farmers did highlight, and it's oftentimes forgotten about, but basic things like having I suppose, changing facilities for an employee and access to a toilet. Okay, so they're very important things where you are employing staff that dairy farmers really need to be aware of, and they're often things that are forgotten about. And I suppose then facilities or automation is very important then as well. So especially for tasks where it eliminates the drudgery out of certain tasks. Okay, so like we have no facilities or machines for or cleaning cubicles, okay, and certain things like that, and straw blowers, for example. So facilities which eliminate the drudgery out of work are very important as well.
And a couple of key points there that you've made, Eamonn, the changing facilities and the toilet, very basic things. And if you think about changing facilities, particularly in the likes of the springtime, people are maybe getting wet, cold, it can lead to getting a bit miserable, maybe getting a cold or flu. And essentially what you're doing is eliminating that and just making the place an overall nice place to work. Your point there about the lack of facilities, expansion, and the facilities didn't necessarily keep up the pace there. Like, that also comes back to salary. And, if you have a flat rate for a milking, there's a very, very much a difference if you're milking 8 to 10 rows of cows versus 15 rows of cows. And, salary should compensate for that accordingly. Finally then, Eamonn, you mentioned the attitude of the dairy farmer and maybe the perception the dry stock farmer has of the dairy farmer's attitude. What exactly do they mean by that?
So I suppose just the perception that dry stock farmers have maybe towards dairy farmers, I suppose it kind of Barry kind of touches back on the first four that we've covered. Okay, so like I suppose in terms of they felt salary. Okay, so where they were working in say for example a factory, they were going to get their check or they're going to get their money into the account at the end of the month, whereas they felt on the dairy farm that they might have to go chasing the dairy farmer for pay. Okay, and I suppose another kind of attitude point that they highlighted, I suppose, from their perspective was, I suppose, a lot of dairy farmers might necessarily know what it feels like to be in the employee shoes. Okay, so a lot of farmers would have kind of gone directly home after college, so they don't necessarily understand the difference between being a farm owner and being an employee. Okay, so they would have highlighted this, and I suppose this thing links back, I suppose, to the regular and having regular working hours. Okay, so whereas a dairy farmer might be quite happy to work long evenings because it's their own farm, this is not necessarily the case for an employee. So they want regular working hours, and they're able to plan the rest of their day in around this. Okay, so just kind of attitudes and motivational difference in like that. So this was that barrier really.
I think you've hit on a lot of points there, Eamon, and it's great, for dairy farmers to get a little bit of insight into the psyche of, staff that are on the farm. And I think this, everything that you've mentioned is relevant for any type of staff, whether it's, a relief milker, somebody just coming in for the spring, or somebody doing part-time or full-time work across the year. If we look then specifically to the roles a dairy farmer can outsource, so you can bring people in and look, we've mentioned it: relief milkers, spring labour, or part-time employment, full-time employment. What sort of work can the dairy farmer delegate, to employees coming into the farm?
Okay, so Emma-Louise, I suppose just from the research point of view, I suppose we highlighted the barriers first, okay, and I suppose some of them might necessarily be of good listening from a dairy farmer's perspective, but I suppose it's no harm to understand these perspectives or these perceptions that are out there as well, okay, so that dairy farmers can improve and then become better employees, okay. So then I suppose what roles that can be outsourced, okay, so as second part of research, really, we looked at 5 case studies. Okay, so touching back on the previous point, so that there is a lot of farmers successfully, and a lot of dairy farmers successfully employing staff across the country. Okay, so it was just a matter of sitting down with advisors in the local region and identifying some different roles on dairy farms. Okay, so I suppose the roles that we identified on a part-time basis for relief milking opportunities, we looked at a spring labour scenario, part-time work, so 2 or 3 days a week, contract winter feeding, and nighttime calving. So there were the case studies that we looked at as part of the research, Emma-Louise.
And looking then, and I suppose moving away from exact tasks, what are the benefits you see to the dry stock farmer and the dairy farmer from an arrangement where the dry stock farmer can have a labour input on a dairy farm?
Okay, Emma-Louise, so I suppose one of the main, from a dry stock farmer's perspective, one of the main benefits that working on a dairy farm can offer, I suppose, is it's an additional source of household income. And I suppose where we were working in on a part-time basis, it's not necessarily going to take up too much of your time, okay, so you're able to pursue other interests and opportunities then as well, okay, and I suppose working on a farm then, I suppose, offers you a greater flexibility to maybe potentially spend more time in your own farm, okay, so a lot of dry stock farmers I would have spoken to highlighted, I suppose, one of the limitations with working in construction or working in a factory, that their own farm often gets put on the back burner and things don't get done. Okay, so working on a dairy farm could offer more flexibility to work on your own farm. And then I suppose finally, with a lot of dry stock farmers commuting into urban centres on a daily basis for work, working with a dairy farmer in your locality, okay, so it's going to eliminate that daily commute and then potentially improve work-life balance for a dry stock farmer. I suppose from a dairy farmer's point of view, in being successful in implementing part-time labour on the farm, okay, so I suppose the main benefit is obviously going to reduce the workload from a dairy farmer's point of view, okay, so just take, for example, a scenario where you could get 4 milkings taken off your workload per week, okay, so just for argument's sake, we say milking is 2 hours, that's going to be 8 hours off your working week. that is a full day's work in any other industry, okay? So that's probably an important point, okay? So where you can even get part-time labour to do a relatively small amount of work, it's still going to free up a lot of your time, okay? And a lot of dairy farmers I spoke to, I suppose the benefits they highlighted was it allows them and it frees up more time to focus on management tasks, okay? So I suppose tasks that are really driving profitability on the farm, okay? So grass budgeting and the financial side of farming as well, okay? So these are often things that can get put on the back burner as well from a dairy farmer's perspective if they're trying to do everything themselves. I suppose it can improve overall labour efficiency on the farm, and I suppose one of the key points in that the dairy farmers I spoke to started research highlighted was just the importance of having someone that knows your system and knows your farm, okay, for in case something ever happened, okay, that there was someone that could step in, or there was someone that could at least show another person the system so they could step in, okay. So that was really one of the benefits dairy farmers felt, to having part-time labour over the calendar year helped them.
I think you've made, again, some interesting points there, Eamon. And, notwithstanding all the barriers that we talked through, the dry stock farmers would see it as a huge benefit to gain some employment on dairy farms. And from a dairy farmer's perspective, I mean, you've done a little a calculation there, just 4 milkings in the week, which, is a small amount of money that you would have to pay out, gives time for farmers to potentially take a step back from the farm, but also then to focus on managing the farm. And I would have heard Matt Ryan speak about this, and many others talk about it. We need the opportunity to reduce the manual day-to-day workload in order to focus on managing the farm and getting the best out of it. And you talk about grassland management. If you get that right, it leads to huge profitability. You'll have paid for the part-time labour, manifold. And finally, Eamon, you make the point that it's now time to source part-time staff. And, if you're heading into a busy spring, this is the time to source the people and train them up to work on the farm come spring. Can you give us top 3 tips for dairy farmers who are interested in taking on part-time staff?
So, Emma-Louise, I suppose from the dairy farmers I spoke to who were successful in implementing part-time roles on farm, okay, so one of the major things that they would have highlighted was starting small and growing then over time, okay, so not to rush into too much too soon, okay, and to have realistic expectations. And I suppose not rushing into too much too soon, and then developing the workload potentially as the relationship grows between the employer and the employee, okay? So that would have been very successful for them farmers. I suppose secondly then, having regular working hours and the length of the working day, okay? So from an employee's point of view, regular working hours are one of the most important things that they're looking for in an employment opportunity, okay? And then I suppose the length of the working day. So one of the things that's going to dictate this the most, Emma-Louise, is the start time of your evening milking, okay? So I suppose the later you're starting that, the longer your working day is, okay? And I suppose from a dairy farmer's perspective, to be implementing or using your 16 and 8 hour milking intervals, okay? So this is very attractive from an employee's perspective, and I suppose from the potential employees that I spoke to, they would have said that a reasonable finishing time, okay, so walking out the gate of the farm would be 6 o'clock in the evening, okay? So dairy farmers then need to start their evening milking time accordingly then to suit this, okay? So where they want to attract staff and retain staff. And then thirdly, I suppose, as they touched on already, so to move away from the perception that you can get labour in the spring, okay, or you only really need it for the spring. I suppose as farms have expanded, and with a lot of dairy farmers now over the 100 cow mark, okay, that there is potential for part-time labour over the course of the calendar year, and where you can successfully implement it. So maybe just 10 hours a week, for example, over the calendar year, and you're going to be more likely to be able to retain them. And there's a lot of work that can be done, okay, and then you could sit down maybe in the spring and have the conversation with your employee. So maybe up a few hours in the spring where the workload is going to be increased. So there would be just my main 3 tips for farmers thinking about trying to get part-time labour over the course of the year. Emma-Louise.
And I think that's a good point to wrap up on, Eamon. And I guess all of your key points would be based on farmers just taking a step back and looking at the overall system and making things realistic. People understanding their expectations and also having a nice place to work and an attractive place to work. I think, maybe we'll have to go back and listen to this a second time to take in all the information that you've given us, Eamon. But in reality, for anyone that is employing staff, there, maybe one of the 5 key points that you have given us today is something that the farmer needs to address and improve upon. Thank you, Eamon.
Thanks very much, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Eamonn O'Flaherty for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.